My guest is Jack Degroot. She's a local writer, and we're very happy to have her here today. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have with us today a number of your books, and we'll be showing those on screen. But tell us how you got started in writing.
When we moved here in 1996, my daughter went to school in Wilmington at Cape Fear Academy, and in 1998 I started writing because I had to have something to do in Wilmington that wasn't costing me any money.
Okay.
So I got a used laptop and sat in my Pontiac Sunfire, and I wrote a book that I'd had a kernel in my head for years and years and years.
No kidding. And how long did it take you to write that book?
It took 13 months, or I guess I should say 2.5 semesters before I had it written.
So are you self-taught? Or how does one become a writer?
Well, I think if you read a lot, you pick up a lot of style, and you pick up a lot of nuances, the way the plot lines go and things like that. I've always read. I've been reading voraciously since I was 9, so and I read a lot of different things, so I think I picked up a lot there. I didn't really start reading any books on how to write or doing writing or anything until I was considering publishing.
Okay, you mentioned the word style. How would you describe your style?
People have said that mine is easy to read. I don't do a lot of flowery things. I do some descriptions, but I try to inflect some humor and some sass. My books are romances generally for the most part, and I try to put you in the life of the person, the character that you're supposed to be reading about, so that you can live vicariously through that person.
How about controversy? I mean, do you, is it part of a writer's style to generate controversy, or
Yeah, well, I think Jodi Picoult does that very well, and in fact I have a book that came out a few years earlier that was called For the Love of Amanda that had some controversy with stem cell research issues. Yes, my books have a lot of controversy.
and maybe drama is the better word. There has to be tension of some sort, does there not, in order to tell a great story?
Conflict, that is the big,
well, thank you.
That is the very big bugaboo. You have to have conflict, and the more conflict you can throw at your character and the more twists and turns, the more people seem to like the book.
All right. When you have an idea for a book, do you have the end in mind, or do you create part of the story as you go?
I rarely have the end in mind. I get my ideas from all kinds of sources, and one particular source was Dateline, and I watched a documentary on Girls Gone Wild, and it just occurred to me, you know, the things that could happen with that kind of a scenario, and that's where Worth Any Price came from. And Worth Any Price is very controversial. It's set in Wilmington, and it involves a serial killer and lewd things the women have to do to get their children back. So it's very dark, it's very deep. I call it my menopause book sometimes. But, yeah, that was a lot of controversy. But there is a movie company interested in maybe producing it, so maybe
That's
one
terrific.
day that'll happen.
Okay, and some of your other books are romance books, for lack of a better term.
I consider myself primarily a romance writer, but you
Okay.
can't just have the romance. You can't just have the meet and greet and everything goes smooth from there. You have to have something to draw your story along. And I tend to, you know, I do a lot of research so that there's something else going on. There's a death or a mystery or something that needs to be solved. In The Secret of the Kindred Spirit, there is a murder, and the Kindred Spirit mailbox at Bird Island is pivotal in helping to solve the murder. But there's a romance. There's the woman, Cassie, who comes to build the controversial bridge at Sunset Beach. She, on her first day, is under the bridge at the old bridge in her kayak, just getting the lay of the land, and all of a sudden a head pops up out of the water wearing a ducat. And that's the controversy. And the police officer that helps get her up off the bank and back on dry land after she's quite frightened, that's where the romance is. So as they both work to solve the mystery, the romance continues also.
One of the key words you just mentioned is research. How much research is involved in preparing for one of your novels?
Well, The Secret of the Kindred Spirit, there was a lot, because I wanted to be very realistic with her building the bridge and how a bridge would be built. So I read 7 books on how to build a bridge.
No kidding.
No kidding. And I talked with Alan Pope with NCDOT about the bridge that at that time was projected for Sunset Beach. And I read Roebling's, the book about Roebling, the Brooklyn Bridge and that was probably one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. And by the time I sat down, I pretty much had an idea how they were going to build this bridge, and that's how I wrote it. And now that the bridge is built, it's kind of nice to look back and see that they built it exactly the way I said.
Well, that's great. It does occur to me that great research, a lot of hours of research are involved in order to really know something bone deep and be able to write about it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. That keeps you honest. You
Right.
really need to do that.
At the same time, most writers write things that reflect their own lives. Is that true for you?
Sometimes that's true. They say you should step out of your boundaries so you learn new things, but in my first book, Climax, I had to learn so much psychologically about drugs and hypnotism that I really didn't want to go into a lot more research for the careers for the hero and heroine. So I used my career, which had been I had been a general sales manager for an automobile dealership, and I used my husband's career. He was a police detective for Fairfax County.
Great.
So I used those things because I had the background for both characters. It kind of had a little of a boomerang there, though, is when the book came out, everybody thought that the characters were based on my husband and I, which they were not.
See?
It was just based, I just used them as our careers as fillers.
All right.
So.
Great writers, in romance books at least, offer a little spice, right?
I offer a lot of spice.
How does that work?
It's working very well. When my first book came out, my husband and I wondered if I should use a nom de plume or if I should use my real name. But we finally did decide we would just go with my name, and if we had to move, we had to move. And it turned out my books are very well received, and I have a nice fan base, and they like it spicy. And,
Good.
you know, now with 50 Shades of Grey, I was writing that way 10 years ago, so.
We do know that a lot of your books are based locally here in the Brunswick County area, right?
Yes, I love this area. I love everything about this area. And when I write, I try to incorporate some history so people who don't know all the history or don't know some of the history can be involved with it. I like to write about the oyster recycling program and the reef building that they do offshore. I like to write about things that people might not find about on their week or two down here.
Well, I'm looking over at your books, and at least a couple of your books reference Sea Trail.
Yes, yes, the Widows of Sea Trail. We have a lot of widows. For some reason, it seems when people retire and come down here, one or the other of the spouses, within a few years, sometimes there's tragedy, and there just seems to be a lot. But I wanted to write a book and encourage women to not, you know, after they've had their time of grief, to get out and find new loves, because it's there for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now tell us about your most recent book, which I think is called Flash
Drive, yes.
Tell us about that.
It's about a woman who lives at Sunset Beach. She actually lives in Ocean Ridge Plantation, and she loses her flash drive at the Food Lion at Sunset Beach. And it's about the man who finds it. And she is very distraught because these are her spicy personal stories that she's written. She's written about her fantasy life, and she's very upset about whose hands this might have fallen into. And the man who finds it lives on the island of Sunset. He lives in Baltimore and has a home down here, and he decides he'd like to return it, but there's no identifying marks. So he plugs it into his laptop and starts reading her stories. And through reading her stories, he starts to fall in love with her. And by the end of his reading all her files, he's decided he's got to find her and show her that he can make her dreams come true. So there's quite a mystery in that there's nothing identifying her, and he has to read through her stories to find the clues that will lead to her.
Great. We won't tell the ending, will we?
No. Well, I'm a romance writer, and a romance writer, there are certain rules, but the one rule to be considered a romance writer is you have to have the happily ever after.
Okay, good, good. We talked before we went on air, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. And I asked you how a writer becomes a disciplined writer, whether you write regularly, day to day, or whether you write in giant spurts. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the creative time for everybody is different. You have to figure out what your creative time is. Some people like to write in the middle of the night. Some people are better in the afternoon. When I first wake up in the morning is my most creative time. That's when I have the most energy, and that's when I like to get upstairs. And my goal is 1,000 words, which is normally 3 pages. I try to do 1,000 words a day. On good days, you can do 10 or 15 pages because you're just going crazy. On some days, you struggle to get those out. But if you can do that, you can get a book within 6 months and have it where you want it. The bad part is when you don't keep yourself to a regimen, you lose time because you have to read back to figure out where you were, and you lose your pacing.
I see. Pacing is
Pacing,
a good word for it.
Yes.
And then, of course, once you get your first draft, that you're not at all finished with your work, are you?
Oh, not at all, not at all.
Tell us about that.
Fortunately, I have a nice network of friends who proof for me. I
Good.
send it out, and everybody takes their stab at it, crosses things out, moves things around, or does whatever they, you know, some add commas, some take commas out. You know, by the end of the thing, I still don't know where the commas are supposed to go sometimes. But then I take what everybody has suggested. I throw out what I think, no, I don't like, and I keep what I think, oh, that's great, or how did I miss that? And so there we go.
Do you ever read your finished product? I'm a lawyer by training, and I occasionally look back at my writing product and say, you know, I could have done that a little better. Do you ever look at your finished product and say, I wish I had?
It's invariable once you get that book in your hand. If you flip through it, you're going to find something and say, oh my God, I spelled that word wrong. Or when you type on a computer, there's just some words that you definitely get wrong. Form and from, I mess up all the time, and spell check won't pick them up.
Right.
I quite often put out for put because the O and the P are so close. So sometimes I look and I say, oh man. But I do have revision normally after 6 months. If you write a book, you really need it to gel. It has to sit and percolate for a while because you need to look at it with fresh eyes to see the things that are wrong. Your mind has a tendency to see things the way you expected them to be or the way you meant them to be, not the way they really are.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
if you let 6 months go and you take a look at it again, you can go back and make some adjustments. And I'll do a revision if there's an error that is just so glaring or bothers me so much I can't stand it.
One final question. I'm sure we have aspiring writers who are watching this program. And I asked you that question before we went on the air. What would you say to them?
If you think you have a book inside you, try to find some quiet time. When you're driving sometime, turn off the radio or your book on tape and just let your mind wander a little while you're, I don't mean wander like wandering off the road or anything, but sometimes when you're just driving on an interstate, rather than just listening to a book or listening to radio, let your mind talk to you. Sometimes you'll find there's a story there. We take too much stimulation in all the time, and our muse or our inner spirit that might have something to say to us doesn't get to sometimes. I find I do very well in the early morning, right before I'm waking up, or late at night, right when I'm laying down to get to sleep. My mind kind of goes through the day or starts the new day, and that's a time when you get some ideas, and those are great ideas. I have had ideas in the middle of the night, and I can tell you for sure, if you think you're going to remember them in the morning, you will not.
So what do you do?
I get up and write them down.
I thought so.
I get up and write them down.
I
I have a notebook in my nightstand and a pen. I grab them and I go into another room and I write them down. Then I come back. Because I have learned that great idea that you had, all you'll remember is that you had a great idea. That's it.
That's interesting. Writers are storytellers, are they not?
Oh, yes, they are.
And that's what you are.
Yes.
Yeah. Jack Degroot, we thank you for being with us today. It's been a fascinating interview.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for having me.
So did I.